Picture a world where kings and queens didn't just fight for land, they fought for the future. Where ink on parchment could change the course of history as powerfully as swords on the battlefield. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a dance of diplomacy, a game of strategy played out in treaties that would shape Europe for centuries to come. For over 100 years, England and France waged a war that stretched generations, but behind the scenes, it was the treaties, those carefully crafted agreements, that truly decided the fate of nations. These weren't just temporary truces or shaky peace deals. They were masterpieces of medieval statecraft, each one a turning point in a conflict that redefined power, loyalty, and the very idea of what it meant to rule. Think about it. In an era without instant communication or modern law, these treaties had to hold kingdoms together with nothing but words and seals. Some brought fleeting peace, others sparked new betrayals, but every single one left an indelible mark on history. From the Treaty of Brétigny, which briefly promised an end to the bloodshed, to the Treaty of Troyes, a bold gamble that nearly rewrote the succession of France, these agreements were where the real drama unfolded. They decided who would wear the crown, which lands would change hands, and how nations would navigate the thin line between war and peace. And here's the thing, these treaties didn't just end battles. They laid the groundwork for the world we know today, shaping everything from national borders to the way countries negotiate with one another. So how do these documents, some just a few pages long, hold such immense power? What secrets do they reveal about the minds of kings, the pressures of war, and the art of diplomacy in an age of chaos? That's the story we're about to unravel. Over the next 25 treaties, we'll journey through the twists and turns of this epic conflict, uncovering the brilliant strategies, the desperate gambles, and the moments where the stroke of a pen changed everything. This isn't just a tale of medieval politics, it's a lesson in how power works, how alliances shift, and how even in the midst of war, the cleverest minds were always thinking several moves ahead. So settle in, because we're about to dive deep into the treaties that didn't just end the 100 Years' War, they defined it. To understand why these treaties mattered, we have to step back to the tangled web of alliances and ambitions that set England and France on a collision course. The roots of the 100 Years' War stretch deep into medieval politics, where bloodlines meant power and land meant wealth. On one side stood England's King Edward III, a ruler with a claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella. On the other, France's Philip VI, determined to keep the crown firmly in Valois hands. But this wasn't just about royal egos, it was about Gascony, the wealthy English-held duchy in southwestern France, and the simmering resentment over who really controlled it. Feudal obligations made the conflict even messier. The English kings, as Dukes of Gascony, technically owed homage to the French crown, a humiliating arrangement that chafed like a rusty suit of armor. When Philip VI confiscated Gascony in 1337, citing Edward's refusal to kneel, it wasn't just a land grab, it was a challenge to England's very identity as a rising power. And Edward's response, he declared himself the rightful king of France, turning a regional squabble into an all-out dynastic war. The early battles set the tone for decades to come. At Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers 10 years later, English longbowmen devastated French knights, proving that battlefield tactics were evolving faster than medieval diplomacy. But winning battles didn't mean winning the war. Without treaties to cement their gains, the English found themselves trapped in a cycle of conquest and rebellion, their overstretched armies struggling to hold territory across the Channel. Meanwhile, France's fractured nobility and peasant revolts like the Jacquerie showed how war could unravel a kingdom from within. This was the powder keg the treaties had to diffuse, or sometimes deliberately ignite. Every clause about borders, every marriage alliance, every promise of truce was really about answering two explosive questions: who gets to rule France, and what price are they willing to pay for it? The answers would shape not just the war, but the very idea of nationhood in Europe, because in the end, this wasn't just a fight between kings. It was a struggle over who had the right to decide what a kingdom even was. In the medieval world, war wasn't a straight path to victory. It was a chessboard, and treaties were the moves that kept the game alive. Unlike today's conflicts, where peace deals often aim to end hostilities for good, medieval treaties were more like strategic breathers. Kings and nobles used them to regroup, rearm, or even outmaneuver their rivals without swinging another sword. Picture a battlefield where both sides are exhausted, coffers drained, and armies stretched thin. A treaty could press pause, giving rulers the one thing they desperately needed: time. Time to rally fresh troops, time to negotiate secret alliances, or time to let famine and plague, the real enemies of medieval campaigns, weaken their foes. But these agreements weren't just about catching their breath. They were masterclasses in realpolitik, where every clause carried hidden stakes. Take the ceremonial act of signing. When kings pressed their seals into wax, it wasn't just for show. Those symbols of authority turned parchment into law, binding entire kingdoms to promises that could unravel with a single betrayal and enforcement. That relied less on courts and more on cold, hard leverage. A king might honor a treaty because breaking it could turn his allies against him, or because he knew his rival was too weak to fight back. The architects of these deals were as fascinating as the treaties themselves. Behind the scenes, it wasn't just monarchs calling the shots. Ambitious nobles like the Duke of Burgundy often played both sides, using treaties to carve out more power for themselves. Then there were the mediators, churchmen, foreign diplomats, even queens who brokered peace not just with words, but with marriage alliances, trade concessions, and cleverly vague language that let each side claim victory. What made these agreements so fragile, yet so pivotal? They thrived on the tension between honor and opportunism. A treaty might last for years or collapse in months when a king spotted weakness. Some, like the Treaty of Brétigny, redrew maps in ink, only for war to erase them later. Others, like the Peace of Calais, were less about lasting peace and more about saving face. But each one reveals a truth about medieval power. Conquest wasn't just won with arrows and armor. It was won in the quiet moments when rivals sat across a table, knives sheathed but minds sharp, rewriting fate with every stroke of the quill. This dance of diplomacy set the stage for every treaty we'll explore next, because to understand the 100 Years' War, you have to see beyond the battles, to the moments when the real war was waged with parchment and ink. Long before the first arrows flew at Crécy or the banners of England and France clashed at Agincourt, there was a treaty, one so seemingly peaceful that history nearly forgot its explosive consequences. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 was supposed to be the end of an era. Crafted by two of medieval Europe's most pious rulers, Henry III of England and Louis IX of France, it was meant to settle generations of squabbling over lands like Aquitaine and Normandy. On the surface, it succeeded. Henry formally gave up his claims to Normandy, Anjou, and other territories lost by his father, King John. In return, Louis confirmed England's control over Gascony, that sliver of southwestern France that would become a tinderbox for war. But here's where diplomacy's devil lurked in the details. The treaty required Henry to pay homage to Louis for Gascony, making the English king a vassal to France on paper. That single clause planted a seed of humiliation that would fester for decades. Imagine the scene, an English monarch kneeling before a French one, swearing loyalty for lands his ancestors had ruled as equals. It wasn't just a ceremonial slight, it was a legal time bomb, because while the treaty brought temporary peace, it never truly resolved who held ultimate authority. Was Gascony English territory held under French oversight, or a French fiefdom grudgingly tolerated by England? The ambiguity suited neither side. Louis, later canonized as Saint Louis, likely saw the agreement as a magnanimous gesture. But future French kings would weaponize that homage clause, using it to meddle in Gascon affairs and even confiscate the duchy when English rulers balked at submitting. For England, the treaty became a slow, burning grievance. Edward I tried to sidestep the issue by negotiating separate agreements, but the core problem remained. How could a king of England, who saw himself as sovereign, kneel to another monarch without undermining his own crown? The Treaty of Paris also exposed a deeper flaw in medieval diplomacy: its reliance on personal relationships over clear legal frameworks. Henry and Louis trusted each other's goodwill, but their successors lacked that mutual respect. When Philip IV of France seized Gascony in 1294, citing Edward I's refusal to appear for homage, it wasn't just a land grab. It was a stark reminder that treaties were only as strong as the kings who upheld them. What makes this agreement so pivotal isn't just its terms, but the precedent it set. By leaving Gascony's status unresolved, it turned the duchy into a perpetual bargaining chip, one that would be seized, traded, and fought over for the next century. The treaty's greatest irony: it was designed to prevent war, yet its unresolved tensions made conflict almost inevitable. When Edward III revived his ancestors' claims to the French throne in 1337, he wasn't just asserting a birthright. He was rejecting the very idea that an English king should ever bow to France, a sentiment rooted in the unresolved humiliations of 1259. So while the Treaty of Paris bears no battle scars or dramatic betrayals, its legacy is written in the wars that followed. It proved that the most dangerous treaties aren't those that fail, but those that almost succeed, papering over cracks without truly mending them. And in the shadow of its unresolved clauses, the 100 Years' War found its first spark. If the Treaty of Paris planted the seeds of war, the Treaty of Brétigny was supposed to rip them out by the roots. By 1360, both England and France were exhausted. The Black Death had ravaged populations, treasuries were drained, and Edward III's stunning victory at Poitiers 4 years earlier had left France in chaos with King John II captured. The stage was set for a peace that could reshape the map, and for a brief, shining moment, Brétigny delivered exactly that. England emerged with territories that would make any medieval monarch envious. Edward gained full sovereignty over Aquitaine, Calais, Ponthieu, and vast swaths of western France, lands that would no longer require humiliating homage to the French crown. In return, he agreed to renounce his claim to the French throne, a symbolic retreat that allowed King John to save face. The ransom for John's release was set at 3 million gold écus, a sum so staggering it would take decades to pay. On parchment, it looked like a masterstroke. England secured its holdings without feudal strings, France avoided total collapse, and both sides could finally breathe. But Brétigny's brilliance was also its fatal flaw. The treaty's success hinged on two fragile assumptions: that Edward would be satisfied with land instead of a crown, and that France could actually pay the ransom. Neither held. Within months, disputes erupted over border territories like Limoges, which the treaty had ambiguously assigned. French officials dragged their feet on payments, while English garrisons, now legal landlords, alienated locals with heavy-handed rule. Worst of all, the treaty lacked a crucial mechanism, a clear process for resolving disputes. Without neutral arbitrators or enforcement, every minor clash risked reigniting the war. The collapse came swiftly. By 1364, with ransom installments unpaid and skirmishes flaring, Edward's son, the Black Prince, invaded France again, this time to enforce the treaty he'd helped negotiate. The irony was bitter. Brétigny, designed to end the war, had become a pretext for restarting it. France's new king, Charles V, seized the moment, declaring the treaty void due to English violations and rallying his nation behind a renewed fight. Yet Brétigny's legacy outlasted its failure. It proved that territorial concessions alone couldn't resolve a conflict rooted in dynastic pride and national identity. Future negotiators would study its shortcomings, realizing that treaties needed more than grand gestures. They required airtight terms, mutual incentives, and above all, a way to hold both sides accountable. And for England, Brétigny became a cautionary tale. Even the sweetest victories could turn to ash when peace was built on parchment instead of trust. The Treaty of Calais in 1360 should have been Brétigny's triumphant finale, the moment when ink and wax turned promises into reality. Instead, it became a masterclass in how medieval diplomacy blurred the lines between peacemaking and theater. While Brétigny outlined the terms, Calais was where England and France staged a spectacle designed to dazzle contemporaries and cement the agreement's legitimacy. At its heart lay a hostage exchange so grand it could have been scripted for a royal chronicle. 40 noble hostages, including King John's own son, Louis of Anjou, were handed over as living guarantees for the 3 million écus ransom. Their presence wasn't just collateral, it was a calculated display of trust and power, proving both sides could bend tradition without breaking it. Yet beneath the pageantry lurked brutal pragmatism. The treaty's financial clauses revealed how deeply war had drained both kingdoms. France's installments were structured like a modern loan, 60,000 écus upfront, followed by annual payments that would stretch for years. But there was a catch. If France defaulted, the hostages would become permanent prisoners, and England could legally reclaim its claim to the French throne. This wasn't just a repayment plan, it was a fiscal tripwire, ensuring that every delayed payment reignited the conflict's original spark. Calais also exposed the fragile psychology behind medieval treaties. The elaborate ratification ceremony held in the very city England had seized a decade earlier wasn't just about legality. It was psychological warfare. By forcing French nobles to witness their king's submission on conquered soil, Edward III turned diplomacy into dominance. The treaty's requirement for French towns to swear oaths directly to England, bypassing their own monarchy, further eroded national unity. These weren't administrative details, they were deliberate acts of political erosion designed to reshape loyalties from the ground up. What makes Calais truly fascinating, though, is how its failures outpaced its achievements. Within months, the hostage system unraveled when Louis of Anjou broke parole, fleeing captivity despite his father's horrified insistence on returning. King John's subsequent decision to surrender himself, an act of chivalric honor that stunned Europe, only highlighted how poorly the treaty accounted for human unpredictability. The ransom payments stalled, territories like Limoges became flashpoints, and by 1369, Charles V declared the entire agreement void. Yet Calais' legacy endures in the paradox it embodied. The more meticulously a treaty tried to control the future, the more violently the past resurfaced. It proved that even the grandest diplomatic theater couldn't mask the truth: medieval peace wasn't made in signing chambers. It was forged, broken, and remade on battlefields, in treasuries, and in the quiet moments when kings weighed honor against survival. And for the next phase of the war, that lesson would shape every quill stroke and sealed parchment to come. By 1375, the 100 Years' War had settled into a grim rhythm, bursts of violence punctuated by exhausted pauses. The Truce of Bruges was one such pause, a ceasefire brokered not by battlefield victories but by sheer fatigue. France's Charles V had clawed back territory through guerrilla tactics, while England's Edward III, now aging and financially strained, faced rebellions at home. Into this stalemate stepped Pope Gregory XI, a mediator desperate to unite Christendom against other threats. His envoys shuttled between courts, crafting a truce that would halt hostilities for 2 years. On paper, it was a diplomatic triumph. In reality, it was a bandage on a wound that refused to heal. What made Bruges different from earlier treaties was its sheer pragmatism. Unlike Bretigny's grand territorial exchanges, this agreement focused on freezing the conflict exactly where it stood: no concessions, no ransoms, just a temporary halt. For Charles, it bought time to consolidate his gains and undermine English alliances. For Edward, it offered respite from the crushing cost of maintaining armies across the Channel. But the truce also revealed how much the war had changed. This wasn't the chivalric clash of Crécy anymore. It was a grinding war of attrition where neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Papal involvement added another layer of complexity. Gregory's mediators weren't just peacemakers, they were power brokers, leveraging spiritual authority to pressure both kings. Threatening excommunication for violators, they turned the truce into a moral test. Yet even the Church's influence had limits. Local lords, particularly in Brittany and Gascony, kept skirmishing, exploiting loopholes that defined peace as the absence of royal armies, not the end of violence. The truce's greatest weakness lay in its brevity. 2 years wasn't enough to rebuild trust or economies, just enough to reload. When hostilities resumed in 1377, the war entered its darkest phase. The truce hadn't failed. It had done exactly what brittle ceasefires do: delay the inevitable. But in that delay lay a crucial lesson. In a conflict where neither side could win outright, even the shortest pauses became strategic weapons. Charles used the time to perfect his scorched earth tactics, while England's leadership splintered further. Bruges proved that sometimes the most consequential treaties aren't those that end wars, but those that quietly shape how they're fought next. The Treaty of Lulingham in 1389 wasn't just another ceasefire. It was a bold gamble to rewrite the rules of the game, with both England and France led by young, untested monarchs. Richard II and Charles VI, the treaty aimed to do what decades of warfare couldn't: forge peace through family ties and long-term vision. At its heart lay a marriage alliance that would have united the crowns themselves: Richard's proposed union with Charles' daughter, Isabella. But this wasn't just about romance. It was about stitching together the frayed edges of two kingdoms with nothing less than dynastic thread. What made Lulingham so revolutionary was its scope. Unlike earlier treaties that haggled over borders or ransoms, this one dared to imagine a future beyond the war. Territorial concessions were part of the deal. England would retain Calais and Bordeaux, while France regained other key strongholds. But the real innovation lay in the treaty's 28-year truce. A generation of peace, planners hoped, might finally break the cycle of vengeance. Even more striking was the proposed joint crusade against pagans in Lithuania, a shared project designed to redirect both nations' martial energies outward. But ambition outpaced reality. The marriage alliance collapsed when Richard wed Isabella of Valois years later under vastly different circumstances, stripping the treaty of its symbolic glue. The territorial clauses, meanwhile, satisfied no one. English hardliners saw them as surrender, while French nobles chafed at conceding even an inch of soil. And the crusade, it dissolved into whispers as both kingdoms turned inward, consumed by internal crises. Richard faced revolts like the Peasants' Uprising, while Charles descended into bouts of madness that fractured French unity. Lulingham's greatest lesson lay in its unintended consequences. By trying to solve everything at once, marriages, borders, truces, crusades, it overreached, leaving no room for the messy realities of medieval politics. Its failure exposed a truth later diplomats would grapple with. In a war fueled by dynastic pride and national identity, no single treaty could untangle the knot. Yet for all its shortcomings, Lulingham hinted at something profound: that lasting peace required more than pauses in fighting. It demanded a reimagining of what England and France could be to each other. And though that vision wouldn't take root in 1389, its seeds would linger, waiting for a future where kings might dare to dream beyond the battlefield. By 1396, the 100 Years' War had become a shadow of its former self, not from decisive victory, but sheer exhaustion. The Truce of Paris wasn't born of triumph or even compromise. It was the diplomatic equivalent of two battered knights leaning on their swords, too weary to swing again. For 28 years, England's Richard II and France's Charles VI agreed to halt hostilities, a pause so lengthy it hinted at desperation. But beneath its surface, this truce revealed something startling. Both kingdoms were now fighting not just each other, but their own unraveling. Richard, once a golden child of diplomacy, had grown increasingly isolated, his authority frayed by rebellions and court intrigues. Charles, meanwhile, descended into episodes of madness that left France ruled by fractious nobles. The truce's terms reflected this chaos: no grand territorial exchanges, no ransoms, just a simple ceasefire that froze borders in place. Yet its simplicity masked a calculated gamble. By pushing the war's resumption decades into the future, both kings hoped time might solve what swords could not. Key to the agreement was the marriage between Richard and Charles' daughter, Isabella, a union meant to symbolize peace. But here's the twist: Isabella was just 6 years old, her betrothal less a partnership than a promissory note. The truce also allowed merchants to resume trade across the Channel, a nod to the war's economic toll. For the first time, diplomacy acknowledged that the real casualties weren't just knights on battlefields, but the farmers, artisans, and traders caught in between. What makes Paris pivotal is what it didn't do. Unlike earlier treaties, it made no attempt to resolve the war's root causes: England's claims to French lands, France's insistence on sovereignty. Instead, it kicked the conflict down the road, trusting that future generations might be wiser. That trust was misplaced. When Henry V reignited the war in 1415, he didn't just break the truce, he exposed its fatal flaw. Peace built on postponement rather than resolution was no peace at all, just a slower kind of war. The truce's legacy lies in its unintended lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous treaties are those that delay conflict without diffusing it. By giving both sides time to regroup, Paris didn't end the 100 Years' War. It ensured the next phase would be fought with fresh fury. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 wasn't just a document. It was a seismic shock to medieval Europe, an audacious rewrite of history that dared to declare an English king the future ruler of France. Picture the scene: Henry V, fresh off his devastating victory at Agincourt, stood at the pinnacle of his power. France, reeling from civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, lay fractured. And in the middle of it all was Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, a figure whose role in this drama would spark centuries of debate. With one stroke of the pen, she and her husband, the mentally unstable Charles VI, disinherited their own son, the Dauphin Charles, and named Henry as heir. It was a move so staggering that contemporaries struggled to believe it was real. But Troyes wasn't just about power grabs, it was a masterclass in political theater. The treaty's terms were meticulously crafted to give every faction something to cling to. Henry would marry Charles' daughter, Catherine, binding the kingdoms through blood. He'd rule as regent until Charles' death, then wear both crowns. France would keep its laws and customs, easing fears of English domination. Even the Burgundians, whose feud with the Armagnacs had pushed France to the brink, got assurances of protection. On paper, it looked like a flawless solution, a united realm, an end to war, and a glittering future where England and France might finally share more than just a coastline. Yet the cracks showed almost immediately. The Dauphin, branded a bastard by his own mother in the treaty's vicious clauses, refused to vanish quietly. Southern France, loyal to his cause, became a stubborn stronghold of resistance. And then there was the treaty's fatal flaw. It assumed Henry would live long enough to see his victory through. When both he and Charles died within months of each other in 1422, leaving an infant heir, the fragile peace shattered like glass. What makes Troyes so fascinating isn't just its ambition, but its legacy. For a brief moment, it made the impossible seem possible, a dual monarchy that could have redrawn Europe's map forever. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the limits of forced unity and how even the grandest diplomatic dreams can crumble when they're built on sand. The Treaty of Amiens in 1423 wasn't just ink on parchment, it was a dagger aimed straight at the heart of France. With the ink barely dry on the Treaty of Troyes, England's regents, ruling for the infant Henry VI, faced a brutal reality. Their claim to the French throne meant nothing without allies to enforce it. Enter Burgundy, the powerhouse duchy whose feud with the French crown had already turned the 100 Years' War into a three-way struggle. Amiens was where these two players sealed their pact, not with vague promises but with cold, hard strategy. For England, it meant military muscle to prop up their shaky regency. For Burgundy's Duke Philip the Good, it was a chance to bleed his Valois rivals dry while carving out more autonomy for himself. What made this treaty so explosive wasn't just the alliance itself, but the precision of its terms. Unlike earlier agreements heavy on symbolism, Amiens read like a wartime contract. Burgundy pledged troops, thousands of them, to fight alongside English forces. In return, England recognized Philip's right to key territories like Champagne and Brie, lands that had been flashpoints between Burgundy and the French crown for decades. The treaty even included joint military command structures, a rare detail that showed just how tightly these allies intended to coordinate. This wasn't just a handshake deal, it was a blueprint for dismantling France piece by piece. Yet Amiens also revealed the fragility of medieval alliances. Both sides knew they were using each other. England needed Burgundy's local knowledge and networks to control occupied territories, while Philip saw the English as temporary battering rams to weaken his Valois cousins. The treaty's secret clauses, whispers of future land swaps and marriage alliances, proved neither party trusted the other fully. And when the tide turned years later, with Joan of Arc rallying French forces, Burgundy's loyalty crumbled faster than a sandcastle at high tide. The real lesson of Amiens lies in what it didn't address, the people caught in the middle. Towns like Meaux, besieged by Anglo-Burgundian forces, learned the hard way that treaties signed in distant chambers meant starvation and slaughter on their streets. For all its military brilliance, the pact failed to account for the very thing that would ultimately doom England's ambitions, the growing sense of French identity that no alliance could suppress. Diplomacy might bind kings and dukes, but it couldn't force peasants and merchants to accept foreign rule. And in that gap between parchment and reality, the fate of the 100 Years' War would ultimately be decided. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 didn't just rewrite alliances, it shattered England's best-laid plans with a single stroke of Burgundian ink. For decades, the Dukes of Burgundy had been the wild card in the 100 Years' War, their loyalty as fickle as the wind. But when Philip the Good sat down with France's Charles VII at Arras, the game changed forever. This wasn't just a political realignment, it was a seismic shift that would tilt the war's momentum decisively toward France. The reason? Burgundy's betrayal wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of years of quiet resentment, strategic miscalculations, and one unforgivable English blunder: the murder of Philip's father, John the Fearless, by French rivals at Montereau in 1419. What made Arras so remarkable was the sheer audacity of its terms. Philip didn't just switch sides, he extracted concessions that would make any medieval ruler blush. France granted him near-sovereign rights over key territories like Auxerre and Macon, effectively carving out a Burgundian state within the kingdom. Even more astonishing, Charles agreed to publicly apologize for his father's role in John's murder, a humiliating act that revealed just how desperately France needed Burgundy's swords. In return, Philip abandoned England's young king, Henry VI, leaving English forces stranded like pawns on a chessboard with no player. The fallout was immediate and brutal. England's grip on northern France, already strained, began to crumble. Towns that had relied on Burgundian support suddenly found themselves isolated, their supply lines cut. The psychological impact was even worse. If Burgundy, England's most powerful ally, could defect, who might be next? Yet the real masterstroke of Arras lay in its subtler clauses. By allowing Philip to keep the territories he'd seized during the Civil War, Charles turned Burgundy's ambition into a weapon against England. No longer would Philip need to side with the English to expand his domains. France had handed him the keys to power on a silver platter. But Arras also exposed the fragility of medieval diplomacy. The treaty's success hinged on personal grudges as much as geopolitical calculus. Philip's thirst for vengeance against his father's killers had simmered for 16 years, and Charles' willingness to exploit that pain revealed a cold political brilliance. Meanwhile, England's regents, focused on holding territory rather than nurturing alliances, had fatally underestimated how deeply the Montereau murder still resonated. The treaty's greatest lesson: in war, loyalty is never absolute. It's a currency, traded by kings and dukes for land, gold, or sometimes just the chance to settle an old score. And when that currency shifts hands, even the mightiest empires can tremble. For England, Arras wasn't just a setback, it was the beginning of the end. The Truce of Tours in 1444 was diplomacy dressed as romance, a glittering facade masking the cold calculations of war-weary kingdoms. On the surface, it seemed like a storybook solution. England's Henry VI, a pious but politically fragile king, would marry Margaret of Anjou, the fiery and fiercely intelligent niece of France's Charles VII. Their union would seal a 22-month ceasefire, offering both nations a respite from decades of bloodshed. But peel back the ceremonial veneer, and you'd find a treaty built not on trust, but on mutual exhaustion and strategic deception. What made Tours so intriguing wasn't what it achieved, but what it revealed about the limits of royal marriages as peacekeeping tools. Unlike earlier dynastic unions, this one came with a glaring omission: no dowry. Margaret arrived in England with little more than her wits and a disputed claim to the strategically vital territory of Maine. To the English public, it felt like a swindle. Their king had gained a queen but surrendered leverage. Meanwhile, Charles VII, ever the shrewd operator, knew the marriage bought him time to consolidate French gains while England's faction-ridden court squabbled over the truce's terms. The truce's symbolic weight outstripped its substance. For Henry, chronically indecisive and besieged by rival nobles like the Duke of York, the marriage was a desperate play for legitimacy. A French queen might soften his image as a failed warrior king. For Margaret, just 15 years old, it was a brutal crash course in realpolitik, thrust into a foreign court where she'd soon become the scapegoat for England's unraveling. The truce's fatal flaw lay in its ambiguity. It deferred rather than resolved the explosive issue of Maine, which England had technically promised to return to France but stubbornly clung to. This wasn't peace, it was a ticking time bomb wrapped in wedding finery. When the truce collapsed in 1449, it did so with a whimper, not a bang. England, bankrupt and divided, could no longer pretend to hold its French possessions. Margaret, now a polarizing figure blamed for Henry's weaknesses, became the lightning rod for English resentment. The Truce of Tours exposed a hard truth. In a war fueled by nationalism and territorial pride, even the most glamorous marriage alliance couldn't paper over the cracks. Personal unions worked when both sides wanted peace, but when they merely wanted a pause, the vows rang hollow and the sword stayed sharp. By 1449, the 100 Years' War had become a chess match played with broken pieces. Every move carried weight, but the game itself seemed impossible to win. The Treaty of Westminster was supposed to be England's last, best chance to salvage its crumbling empire in France. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about how desperation can twist diplomacy into self-sabotage. The stage was set when England, reeling from the Truce of Tours' collapse, faced a stark choice: negotiate from weakness or risk losing Normandy entirely. What emerged was a document so riddled with contradictions that it managed to anger both sides simultaneously, a feat of diplomatic incompetence that would accelerate England's downfall. At first glance, Westminster's terms seemed almost generous to France. England agreed to surrender key fortresses in Normandy, including the vital port of Harfleur, in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. But here's where the treaty's fatal flaw emerged. It demanded French recognition of English sovereignty over the rest of Normandy, a demand Charles VII had no intention of honoring. The negotiators, pressed by England's bankrupt treasury and rebellious nobles, had crafted a deal that satisfied no one. For the French, it was a half measure that left English boots on their soil. For the English, it was a humiliating retreat disguised as compromise. The treaty's architects underestimated how deeply the war had poisoned trust between the two nations. Previous agreements like Brétigny or Troyes had at least offered grand visions, territorial swaps, dynastic unions, shared crusades. Westminster offered nothing but ambiguity. Its clauses were so vague on enforcement that local commanders in Normandy interpreted them differently, leading to skirmishes within weeks of signing. Even the ceasefire's duration was left dangerously unclear. Was it 5 years, 10? The parchment itself seemed to shrug. What truly doomed Westminster, though, was its timing. By 1449, the French military had evolved into a disciplined force under leaders like Jean Bureau, whose artillery would soon render medieval castles obsolete. England, meanwhile, was paralyzed by infighting between Henry VI's fractious advisors. The treaty didn't account for this power imbalance. It assumed both sides were equally invested in peace. When Charles VII promptly violated the spirit of the agreement by encouraging Norman towns to revolt, England lacked the resources to respond. Within months, towns like Rouen and Keene, cornerstones of English rule for decades, fell like dominoes. The lesson of Westminster wasn't just about bad negotiation. It was about the hubris of clinging to empire when the tide had turned. England's diplomats had treated Normandy as a bargaining chip, forgetting that real people lived there. Norman nobles, tired of decades as pawns, began defecting to France en masse. The treaty's greatest irony, by trying to preserve English influence through half-hearted concessions, it accelerated its collapse. In the end, Westminster proved that the most dangerous treaties aren't those that fail outright, but those that delay the inevitable while eroding the last shreds of credibility. And for England, that erosion would soon become a landslide. The Treaty of Louviers in 1492 might seem like an afterthought, a few scribbled lines at the end of a bloody century. But this quiet agreement, signed long after the last English troops had staggered home from France, held a mirror to everything the 100 Years' War had changed. By the time Henry VII of England and Charles VIII of France put their seals on this document, the world had shifted beneath their feet. The age of knights and feudal oaths was fading, replaced by something new. The dawn of nation-states where borders mattered more than bloodlines, and diplomacy began to look less like personal deals between kings and more like the cold calculus of modern statecraft. Louviers itself was a modest affair compared to the grand treaties that came before. No vast territories changed hands, no royal marriages were brokered, no thrones were promised. Instead, it dealt with the war's stubborn leftovers, outstanding ransom payments for long-dead prisoners, lingering disputes over trade rights in Calais, and the fate of a handful of border fortresses that had been fought over so many times their stones could tell the war's entire story. But in its very mundanity lay its significance. This wasn't a treaty to end a war, it was a treaty to tidy up after one, acknowledging that even after the banners were furled and the swords sheathed, the business of power continued. What makes Louviers truly fascinating is how it reflected the Renaissance's emerging ethos. Gone were the flowery chivalric vows of earlier agreements, replaced by precise legal language that treated kings not as feudal overlords, but as executives of sovereign states. When Charles agreed to pay Henry 50,000 gold crowns not as tribute, but as a contractual settlement, it signaled a seismic shift. Money was no longer about honor, it was about balance sheets. And the treaty's insistence on third-party arbitration for future disputes. That was the embryonic form of international law, a far cry from the days when conflicts were settled by personal oaths or trial by combat. Yet Louviers also served as the war's final irony. After a century of bloodshed sparked by England's claim to the French crown, the treaty didn't even mention it. Henry, the first Tudor king, had neither the means nor the appetite to revive Edward III's old dreams. Instead, he focused on what really mattered to his fragile new dynasty: cold, hard cash and a stable border. In that sense, Louviers wasn't just an epilogue, it was a eulogy for medieval kingship itself, proof that the age of personal empires was giving way to something sharper, leaner, and far more pragmatic. The treaty's legacy whispers through history in unexpected ways. Its meticulous record-keeping foreshadowed the bureaucratic states of the 16th century. Its reliance on neutral mediators hinted at the diplomatic networks that would later bind Europe together. Even its failures, like the lingering resentment over unpaid ransoms that soured Anglo-French relations for decades, taught future negotiators the cost of loose ends. The 100 Years' War had begun with a king's bruised ego over feudal homage. It ended with a ledger and a handshake, and in that quiet accounting, the modern world was born. The treaties of the 100 Years' War didn't just end battles, they rewrote the rules of power itself. Behind every inked signature and broken promise lay a seismic shift in how kingdoms operated, setting the stage for modern Europe. Take the rise of centralized monarchies. Before the war, kings ruled through a patchwork of feudal loyalties. Their authority constantly negotiated with rebellious nobles. But the relentless demands of war-funding armies, securing borders, negotiating treaties forced rulers to consolidate power like never before. France's Charles VII didn't just reclaim his throne. He built the first standing army in Western Europe, funded by permanent taxes that bypassed feudal privileges. England's Henry V, though remembered for Agincourt, was equally ruthless in streamlining royal administration to bankroll his campaigns. These weren't just military innovations, they were the birth pangs of the nation-state, where loyalty shifted from local lords to the crown itself. The treaties accelerated feudalism's decline in subtler ways too. When the Treaty of Brétigny granted England direct control over Aquitaine, it severed the old feudal chain. No more English dukes paying homage to French kings. Suddenly, territory wasn't about personal oaths but cold legal claims, a concept that would define future conflicts like the 30 Years' War. Even failed agreements left their mark. The Treaty of Troyes, which tried to merge England and France under one crown, exposed the limits of dynastic diplomacy. Its collapse proved that shared bloodlines couldn't override emerging national identities, a lesson Europe's rulers would grapple with for centuries. Diplomacy itself transformed under the pressure of these negotiations. Medieval treaties had once relied on chivalric honor and religious oaths, but the 100 Years' War birthed something closer to modern statecraft. The Treaty of Arras, for instance, included detailed territorial maps, a novelty at the time, while the Truce of Tours introduced third-party mediators like the Pope as neutral arbiters. These innovations laid groundwork for the Peace of Westphalia and even the Congress of Vienna, proving that war's greatest legacy might be the tools it forged to prevent future conflicts. Perhaps the most enduring impact, though, was on the idea of sovereignty itself. Early treaties like Paris in 1259 hinged on feudal hierarchies, but by Louviers in 1492, kings negotiated as equals, their authority derived from borders rather than birthright. This quiet revolution didn't just end a war, it ushered in a world where nations, not dynasties, held ultimate power. And that's the real twist. The treaties didn't just settle the 100 Years' War. They helped invent the very concept of international relations we recognize today. Behind every treaty of the 100 Years' War stood a constellation of personalities, kings breathing fire onto parchment, queens maneuvering in the shadows, and mediators threading impossible compromises. Take Edward III of England, whose claim to the French throne ignited the conflict. This wasn't just a king who won battles, he was a master of diplomatic theater. At the Treaty of Calais, he didn't just demand ransom for King John II, he orchestrated a spectacle, forcing French nobles to kneel on conquered soil. His brilliance lay in understanding that treaties weren't just about terms. They were psychological warfare, designed to humiliate as much as to pacify. Then there's Charles VII of France, the so-called victorious, who clawed his kingdom back from the brink. Unlike his predecessors, Charles grasped that treaties were tools to buy time. The Truce of Tours, with its marriage alliance and vague promises, gave him breathing room to reorganize his armies and unleash game-changing artillery. His negotiators, like the cunning Regnault of Chartres, pioneered clauses so airtight they left English diplomats scrambling. Where Edward wielded treaties like a hammer, Charles used them as scalpels, each incision carefully placed to weaken his enemy's grip. But the real unsung architects, the mediators, Pope Gregory XI, shuttling between courts during the Truce of Bruges, wasn't just a peacemaker, he was a power broker, threatening excommunication to enforce compliance. Then there's Philip the Good of Burgundy, whose defection at Arras wasn't impulsive betrayal but cold calculation. His father's murder by French rivals had festered for years, and when he finally switched sides, he didn't just negotiate territory. He extracted a royal apology, turning personal vengeance into political gold. The women behind these deals were equally formidable. Isabeau of Bavaria, France's queen during the Treaty of Troyes, remains one of history's most controversial figures. Was she a traitor for disinheriting her son, or a pragmatist salvaging a broken kingdom? Her signature on that document reveals the brutal choices women faced in a war that treated them as pawns until they seized the board. Meanwhile, Margaret of Anjou, married off in the Truce of Tours, arrived in England with no dowry but a razor-sharp mind, soon out-maneuvering the men who thought they'd controlled her. What these figures shared was a grasp of diplomacy's darkest truth. Treaties weren't about fairness, they were about leverage. When Henry V strong-armed Charles VI into naming him heir at Troyes, he knew the agreement's power lay not in its legality, but in the terror of his armies camped outside Paris. Likewise, when Charles VII lured Burgundy away from England at Arras, he wasn't offering peace, he was offering Philip the Good a better deal. The parchment merely formalized what swords had already decided. Yet for all their cunning, these negotiators were prisoners of their era. Edward III couldn't foresee how Bretigny's territorial clauses would unravel without enforcement. Charles VII never imagined his artillery would render castle-centric treaties obsolete, and none anticipated how emerging national identities forged in resentment of foreign occupation would make their dynastic bargains obsolete. The treaties they crafted were masterpieces of medieval strategy, but time and tide would expose their limits, because in the end, even the sharpest quills couldn't outright the will of nations finding their voice. When we think of medieval diplomacy, images of kings and armored knights might dominate, but some of the 100 Years' War's most pivotal negotiations were steered by women wielding quills, not swords. Take Margaret of Anjou, the teenage queen thrust into England's political storm by the Truce of Tours. Far from a passive pawn, she became Henry VI's most tenacious defender, rallying Lancastrian forces long after his mental collapse. Her letters to French and Burgundian courts reveal a razor-sharp strategist, leveraging her Angevin roots to keep allies from abandoning England's sinking ship. Then there's Isabeau of Bavaria, France's vilified queen, whose signature on the Treaty of Troyes wasn't surrender, it was triage. With her husband Charles VI lost to madness and Paris in Anglo-Burgundian hands, she bargained to save what fragments of the kingdom remained, even at the cost of disinheriting her own son. These women operated in a world that openly dismissed their political legitimacy, yet they exploited loopholes in the system with breathtaking skill. When official channels failed, they mastered backchannel diplomacy, hosting secret summits during hunting parties, exchanging coded messages through confessors, or using their households as intelligence hubs. Yolande of Aragon, mother-in-law to both Margaret and the Dauphin Charles, bankrolled his resistance from the shadows, proving that a noblewoman's coffers could be as decisive as any army. Even Joan of Arc, though not a negotiator herself, became a living symbol of how women could shift diplomatic tides. Her very presence at Orleans forced the English to recalculate their entire French strategy. The treaties themselves bear subtle fingerprints of feminine influence. The marriage clauses in Tours and Troyes weren't just political theater, they were carefully crafted lifelines. Margaret's union bought England time, while Isabeau's daughter Catherine became the glue binding Henry V's fragile claim to France. And let's not forget the dowries, or lack thereof. Margaret arrived in England with empty coffers but a mind stocked with Angevin legal precedents. turning her supposed disadvantage into leverage. These women understood that in diplomacy, symbols mattered as much as swords. A queen's presence at a signing ceremony could lend legitimacy, her tears at a funeral could sway public opinion, and her silence at the right moment could speak louder than any proclamation. Yet their legacies remain tangled in paradox. Chroniclers of the time, almost all men, either vilified them as scheming Jezebels or erased their contributions entirely. Isabeau was painted as a traitor for Troyes, though no king faced such condemnation for far greater betrayals. Margaret became the scapegoat for England's losses, her political acumen recast as unnatural ambition. What these portrayals miss is the impossible tightrope these women walked. They negotiated not just with foreign powers, but with the expectations of their gender. Every display of strength risked accusations of hysteria. Every compromise could be spun as weakness. The real lesson of their stories isn't just that women shaped the 100 Years' War, it's how they did it. Without official titles or armies, they weaponized the very things the patriarchy underestimated: kinship networks, religious piety, even the domestic sphere. When Isabeau hosted peace banquets, she wasn't just serving wine. She was curating the guest list to engineer chance encounters between enemies. When Margaret took over Henry's correspondence, she wasn't just writing letters, she was rebuilding burnt bridges with every carefully chosen word. Their greatest treaty wasn't written on parchment. It was the unspoken pact between women across borders, proving that in the chess game of medieval politics, the queen could be the most powerful piece on the board. Beneath the grand proclamations of sovereignty and the flashy territorial swaps, the treaties of the 100 Years' War were anchored in something far more pragmatic: cold, hard economics. These agreements weren't just about crowns and conquests, they were detailed financial instruments, meticulously crafted to fill treasuries, punish enemies, and reward allies. Take the ransom clauses, for example. When King John II of France was captured at Poitiers, the Treaty of Brétigny didn't just demand his release, it imposed a ransom of 3 million gold écus, a sum so vast it would take France decades to pay. This wasn't just compensation, it was economic warfare designed to cripple France's ability to fight back while lining England's coffers. But ransoms were just the tip of the ledger. Trade rights woven into these treaties shaped economies for generations. The Treaty of Calais in 1360 didn't just hand England control of the port city, it granted English merchants exclusive access to the lucrative border wine trade, effectively strangling French competitors. Meanwhile, French negotiators retaliated with clauses like those in the Truce of Bruges, which barred English wool from Flemish markets, knowing it would trigger recessions in England's textile regions. These weren't side notes, they were calculated strikes at the economic engines that fueled each kingdom's war machine. Reparations added another layer of complexity. After the Treaty of Troyes, England demanded annual payments from French towns under its control, not just as tribute, but as a mechanism to enforce loyalty. Towns that resisted faced punitive tariffs, while those that complied received trade privileges, a medieval version of economic incentives. Even the marriage alliances had fiscal fine print. Margaret of Anjou's dowry in the Truce of Tours included not land or gold, but the contested territory of Maine, turning a royal wedding into a real estate transaction. What made these economic clauses so potent was their dual edge. They could stabilize or destabilize at a stroke. The Treaty of Arras in 1435, for instance, included secret payments from France to Burgundy, not just for peace, but to fund Burgundy's ongoing campaigns against England. It was a masterstroke. France literally paid its enemy's ally to switch sides, proving that in medieval diplomacy, money didn't just talk, it orchestrated betrayals. Yet the most revealing economic weapon was debt itself. Treaties like Westminster in 1449 forced England to mortgage future tax revenues to pay for past wars, creating a spiral of borrowing that eventually bankrupted the crown. Meanwhile, France's Charles VII used treaty imposed trade bans to nurture domestic industries, knowing that economic independence was as vital as military victory. In the end, the 100 Years' War wasn't just won on battlefields, it was won in market squares, tax offices, and the cramped scriptoria where scribes tallied the cost of every broken promise. The real lesson: when kingdoms clashed, gold was as lethal as steel. In the smoke-filled chambers where kings and diplomats haggled over borders and ransoms, there was always a third presence at the table: the church. More than just spiritual advisors, clergymen wielded influence that could make or break treaties during the 100 Years' War. Their power didn't come from armies or gold, but from something far more potent in medieval Europe: the keys to salvation. When negotiators swore oaths on holy relics like the fragment of the true cross at Brétigny or the crown of thorns at Troyes, they weren't just following ceremony. They were binding their souls, knowing that breaking such vows risked eternal damnation. This was diplomacy where parchment carried the weight of divine judgment, and the threat of excommunication could force even the proudest monarch to reconsider. The Pope's mediators played a role modern diplomats would hardly recognize. Take the Truce of Bruges in 1375, where papal legates didn't just suggest terms, they enforced them with spiritual sanctions. Any lord who violated the ceasefire faced interdict, cutting off his subjects from sacraments like baptism and last rites. For rulers whose legitimacy rested on divine right, this wasn't just pressure, it was existential blackmail. Even battle-hardened commanders like the Black Prince hesitated to cross these lines, knowing rebellion against the church could unravel their authority faster than any military defeat. Yet the church's influence wasn't just about threats. Its network of monasteries and bishoprics functioned as the era's intelligence service. Abbots along pilgrimage routes passed messages between warring courts, while bishops with ties to both England and France, like the Archbishop of Canterbury during the Treaty of Calais, crafted compromises secular envoys couldn't envision. The Vatican itself became a clearinghouse for grievances, with popes like Gregory XI personally reviewing territorial disputes that would otherwise spark fresh wars. Religious language also shaped the treaty's very structure. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 invoked the peace of Christ as its guiding principle, while Troyes framed Henry V's claim to France as a divine mandate to end schism. This wasn't just flowery prose, it was legal alchemy, transforming raw power grabs into morally sanctioned acts. Even financial clauses dripped with piety. Ransom payments were often earmarked for crusades or cathedral buildings, laundering war profits through holy causes. But the church's role had a dark underside. Its mediation wasn't neutral, it served its own interests. When Avignon-based popes leaned toward France or Rome-backed ones favored England, their impartial judgments often suspiciously aligned with political patrons. The Treaty of Arras, which shattered England's Burgundian alliance, was brokered by a papal legate whose French sympathies were an open secret. And when Joan of Arc, a figure literally guided by heavenly voices, threatened to upend the status quo, church tribunals swiftly condemned her, proving that divine will conveniently aligned with the powers that be. What makes this interplay of faith and politics so fascinating is how it reveals medieval Europe's paradox. The same church that preached peace also profited from war, selling indulgences to fund campaigns and blessing armies on both sides. Its greatest legacy in these treaties may be the lesson that in diplomacy, sacred and secular were never truly separate. just two sides of the same coin, minted in the crucible of power. And when the final treaty was signed, it wasn't just kings who claimed victory, but the institution that had quietly shaped every clause in God's name. The ink might have dried on grand territorial claims and royal marriages, but the real teeth of these treaties lay in their military stipulations, the unglamorous life or death fine print that dictated where armies could march, who went home alive, and how long the killing would pause. Take ceasefires, for instance. These weren't just gentlemen's agreements scrawled on parchment. They were logistical masterpieces, often specifying exact dates, times, and even the number of strides soldiers had to retreat from contested walls. The Truce of Bruges in 1375 didn't just call for a halt. It mandated that English garrisons in Normandy could receive supplies but not reinforcements, a clause designed to starve their war machine without provoking outright violence. Prisoner exchanges were another battlefield waged on paper. After Agincourt, the Treaty of Troyes included meticulous rosters of captive nobles, their ransom values calculated like medieval stock prices. But the real intrigue lay in the unspoken hierarchies. A knight might be swapped for two archers, while a duke's freedom could buy an entire village immunity from plunder. These weren't just transactions, they were power plays. When the Black Prince released French King John II under the Treaty of Calais, he didn't just demand gold, he insisted on high-profile hostages like the king's own son, turning family ties into collateral. Disarmament clauses revealed even more about medieval warfare's gritty realities. The Treaty of Westminster in 1449 didn't just order English troops out of Normandy, it specified how many cannonballs could be left in each fortress's arsenal, down to the last pound of gunpowder. Some agreements went further, banning the recruitment of mercenaries for fixed periods or outlawing scorched earth tactics that ravaged farmland. These weren't acts of charity, they were cold calculations. A kingdom that burned its enemies' crops today might starve its own army tomorrow if the land changed hands. What makes these military terms so revealing is how they mirrored the war's shifting technologies and tactics. Early treaties like Brétigny focused on traditional concerns, castle garrisons, knightly ransoms, and the movement of men at arms. But by the 1400s, clauses began addressing gunpowder artillery, standing armies, and even naval blockades. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 explicitly banned Burgundian ships from aiding English supply lines, proving how warfare had leaped from land to sea. Yet for all their precision, these stipulations often crumbled under the weight of human ingenuity or deceit. Commanders exploited loopholes by reclassifying troops as personal retinues to skirt troop limits. Temporary fortifications built during ceasefires became permanent strongholds, and prisoner exchanges frequently delayed until captives died of disease, rendering the terms moot. The treaty's greatest irony was their inability to constrain the very violence they sought to tame, because in the end, no clause could account for a commander's hunger for glory or a king's thirst for vengeance. These military stipulations weren't just footnotes to history. They were the war's pulse, ticking through every lull and flare-up, proving that even in an age of chivalric myth, the real art of war was written in logistics, not legend. And when quills replaced swords at the negotiating table, the battles didn't end, they just moved to parchment, where every comma carried the weight of 1,000 lives. A treaty wasn't just signed, it was staged. Every step, from the location of negotiations to the wax that sealed the parchment, carried layers of meaning designed to humiliate or elevate. Take the Treaty of Brétigny's ratification. Edward III insisted it happen in Calais, the English-held port his armies had starved into submission a decade earlier. For French nobles forced to kneel on conquered soil, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was theater of the vanquished. Even the seating arrangements whispered power dynamics. When mediators brokered the Truce of Bruges, they placed England's Black Prince on a dais slightly higher than France's envoys, a visual insult the chroniclers noted with relish. The documents themselves were works of art and propaganda. Illuminated charters like those from Troyes didn't just list terms, they depicted Henry V enthroned beneath Fleurs de Lis, his new French subjects offering homage. These weren't records, they were coronation portraits in legal disguise. The parchment's quality sent signals too. When Philip the Good of Burgundy received his copy of the Treaty of Arras, it arrived on vellum so flawless, so impossibly white, it screamed wealth and permanence, a subtle rebuttal to anyone who thought his alliance with France was temporary. Rituals turned signatures into spectacles. At the Treaty of Paris in 1259, Louis IX washed Henry III's hands before they signed, a biblical gesture of humility that masked the treaty's punitive terms. Centuries later, the Treaty of Tours leveraged a different sacrament marriage. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou's union was consecrated by the Archbishop of Rouen with relics so holy, breaking the accompanying truce would verge on sacrilege. Even the wax seals were weapons. Edward III used a double-sided seal for Brétigny, one face showing him as English king, the other as self-styled ruler of France, a physical manifestation of his two-headed ambition. Language itself became a battlefield. Latin, the lingua franca of treaties, lent authority but could also obscure treachery. The Treaty of Troyes described Henry V as France's heir and regent in phrasing so ornate, Burgundian lawyers later argued it never technically disinherited the Dauphin. Meanwhile, vernacular clauses like those in the Treaty of Calais specifying Gascon wine tariffs were deliberately blunt, ensuring local merchants understood their new masters. The scribes who drafted these texts were the era's spin doctors, turning military stalemates into moral victories with a well-placed whereas or henceforth. Symbolism bled into the supernatural. Oaths sworn on relics weren't just solemn, they were thought to carry divine retribution. When John II pledged to honor Bretigny's ransom terms, he did so while touching a fragment of the true cross, inviting God's wrath if he defaulted. The Treaty of Arras went further, requiring Philip the Good and Charles VII to share communion, a gesture so intimate it bound them not just as allies, but as souls accountable to heaven. Breaking such oaths risked more than war, it risked damnation, yet for all their pomp, these performances couldn't mask the fragility beneath. The same rituals meant to sanctify treaties also revealed their precariousness. Why else stage such elaborate shows of consent unless you feared defiance? When the Dauphin Charles rejected Troyes, he didn't just refuse terms, he mocked the very choreography of power, proving that no amount of wax, vellum, or holy water could compel loyalty. In the end, the treaty's greatest symbolism lay in their futility. The more elaborate the ceremony, the more desperately kings were trying to conjure permanence in a world where every agreement was just a prelude to the next betrayal. The fate of a treaty often hinged on forces far beyond its clauses, on the silent calculations of power that parchment alone could never contain. Compare Brétigny and Troyes, two of the war's most ambitious agreements, and you'll find masterclasses in why diplomacy thrives or crumbles. Brétigny, signed in 1360 at the height of English dominance, should have been unshakable. Edward III secured vast territories without feudal obligations. France agreed to a staggering ransom, and both sides stood to gain from peace. Yet within years, it collapsed like a sandcastle at high tide. Troyes, by contrast, was born under darker skies. France, fractured by civil war, its king mentally broken, yet its legacy outlasted its signatories by centuries. The difference: Bretigny relied on goodwill, Troyes built its foundations on cold, hard necessity. Enforceability was the first fault line. Bretigny's negotiators, drunk on victory, drafted terms so vague they invited chaos. When disputes flared over border towns like Limoges, there were no neutral arbitrators, no mechanisms to mediate, just the ominous silence of unresolved grievances. Troyes learned from this mistake. Its architects didn't just declare Henry V France's heir, they embedded him in the machinery of power. As regent, he controlled the treasury, the bureaucracy. Even the Dauphin's disinheritance was etched in language so precise it left no room for reinterpretation. The lesson: a treaty survives not by the nobility of its ideals, but by the ruthlessness of its enforcement. Timing, too, dictated destiny. Bretigny came when England's star was ascendant, but that very strength bred complacency. Edward assumed France would honor terms signed under duress, forgetting that humiliation festers into rebellion. Troyes, though, was forged in France's hour of maximum vulnerability. With Burgundy's dagger at its back and Henry's armies at its gates, the French crown had no choice but to comply. Paradoxically, this desperation made the treaty stick longer. When your enemy's alternatives are annihilation or submission, even bitter pills get swallowed. Yet the truest divide lay in how these treaties addressed identity. Bretigny treated territories like chess pieces, ignoring the people who lived there. English garrisons alienated Gascon nobles with heavy-handed rule, while French peasants resented being traded like chattel. Troyes, for all its flaws, grasped the power of symbolism. By marrying Catherine of Valois and framing himself as France's savior from dynastic chaos, Henry didn't just claim a crown, he crafted a narrative of legitimacy. It didn't matter that southern France rejected him. The treaty's psychological scaffolding made defiance feel like treason rather than patriotism. But perhaps the most telling contrast was adaptability. Bretigny's rigid territorial clauses shattered when the Black Prince tried to enforce them with more war. Troyes, though designed to be permanent, contained hidden flexibilities. Its recognition of local French laws and customs gave communities just enough autonomy to tolerate English rule, while its dynastic union offered a path to gradual assimilation. When treaties fail, it's rarely because their terms were unjust, it's because they couldn't bend to the winds of change. In the end, these agreements reveal a truth that echoes through all diplomacy. The strongest treaties aren't those written in the ink of temporary advantage, but those etched into the bedrock of human nature. They understand that power must be balanced with consent, ambition with realism, and words with the unspoken forces that truly move history. Bretigny and Troyes weren't just documents, they were mirrors reflecting the fragile alchemy that turns promises into permanence. The treaties of the 100 Years' War didn't fade into dusty archives when the fighting stopped. They became blueprints for how nations would wield power for centuries to come. Consider sovereignty, that cornerstone of modern states. Before the war, authority was a tangled web of feudal oaths where a king like Edward III could simultaneously rule England while bowing to France as Duke of Gascony. But treaties like Bretigny shattered that duality, carving out territories where English kings ruled without homage. This wasn't just land swapping. It was the embryonic idea that borders could define absolute authority, a principle that would crystallize in the Peace of Westphalia 200 years later. The war's diplomatic innovations seeped into the DNA of international relations. The Treaty of Arras didn't just broker peace between France and Burgundy. It pioneered third-party mediation, with papal legates acting as neutral arbiters, a precursor to modern organizations like the United Nations. Even failure taught lasting lessons. The Treaty of Troyes' collapse proved that dynastic claims couldn't override national identity, a warning later empires ignored at their peril when they tried to stitch together multicultural realms in the 19th century. Military clauses in these agreements foreshadowed the laws of war. The Truce of Bruges' meticulous ceasefire terms, down to regulating supply convoys, evolved into today's Geneva Convention protocols on humanitarian pauses. And the financial reparations demanded at Calais, they became the template for post-war restitution, from the indemnities levied after the Franco-Prussian War to the reparations debates of Versailles in 1919. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the treaty's unintended consequences. By forcing kings to negotiate with rebellious provinces like Brittany or Burgundy, they inadvertently nurtured regional identities that would later challenge centralized power. The same agreements that sought to consolidate monarchies planted the seeds of federalism and devolution. Even the parchment itself set standards. The Treaty of Paris triplicate copies, stored in London, Paris, and Rome, established protocols for document authentication that underpin modern treaty registries. These medieval accords also birthed the art of spin. When Henry V framed the Treaty of Troyes as France's salvation rather than its surrender, he was crafting a narrative, something every modern leader knows is as vital as the terms themselves. The war's diplomats discovered a truth that still resonates. The best treaties aren't just about ending conflicts. They're about shaping the stories nations tell themselves long after the ink dries. From the ashes of this century-long struggle emerged something unexpected, a playbook for how states interact, not just on battlefields but in the quiet chambers where power is passed into paragraphs. The treaty's true victory wasn't in settling a war, but in teaching the world that even the fiercest rivals could be bound by words, provided those words were backed by the unspoken forces of necessity, identity, and time. Medieval treaties weren't the unbreakable contracts we imagine today. They were living documents, bending and snapping under the weight of ambition, necessity, and sometimes pure spite. Take the myth of the sacred oath. While treaties were often sworn on relics with elaborate religious ceremonies, kings treated them more like tactical pauses than eternal vows. Consider Edward III's stance after the Treaty of Brétigny. He publicly upheld its terms while quietly encouraging his generals to provoke border skirmishes, knowing France couldn't afford to retaliate. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was the reality of medieval statecraft. Honor mattered, but survival mattered more. Another persistent fallacy is that treaties were uniformly enforced. In truth, their power depended entirely on who held the upper hand. The Treaty of Troyes, which declared Henry V heir to France, was enforced ruthlessly in Paris, where English troops stood guard but ignored in the south, where the Dauphin's loyalists mocked it as parchment tyranny. Local lords often played both sides, citing vague clauses to justify switching allegiances. The Duke of Brittany, for instance, invoked the Treaty of Calais and to flip between England and France 6 times in 2 decades, proving that loyalty was negotiable if the terms were flexible enough. Then there's the romantic notion that treaties ended wars cleanly. The reality was messier. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 promised peace, yet within years, French officials were confiscating Gascon wine shipments, while English privateers harassed French fishermen, both sides exploiting loopholes to keep fighting without technically breaking the truce. These weren't violations, they were calculated interpretations. Medieval lawyers excelled at crafting clauses so ambiguous that each side could claim moral high ground, turning diplomacy into a linguistic chess game. Perhaps the biggest misconception is that kings saw treaties as failures. In fact, they were often strategic masterstrokes. When Charles VII signed the Truce of Tours, buying time with a marriage alliance, his advisors weren't conceding defeat, they were regrouping. The treaty's 22-month ceasefire let him reform his army, import cutting-edge cannon technology, and starve English garrisons of supplies. By the time fighting resumed, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Treaties weren't endpoints, they were gear shifts in a longer war machine. What modern observers miss is how fluid medieval notions of legality were. A treaty wasn't a binding contract but a snapshot of power dynamics at a given moment. When circumstances changed, so did commitments. The Treaty of Arras collapsed not because Burgundy's Philip the Good was deceitful, but because the French crown's weakening grip made his English alliance suddenly obsolete. In this world, the only true breach of treaty was weakness, and the only unforgivable sin was being caught. The treaties of the 100 Years' War reveal a truth that still resonates. Diplomacy isn't about morality or even legality. It's about leverage. Kings didn't break promises because they were dishonorable. They adapted them because they were pragmatic. And in that unspoken dance between ink and power, the real rules of the game were written. As we trace the arc of these 25 treaties, what emerges isn't just a chronicle of war and peace. It's a revelation about the very nature of power. The 100 Years' War didn't end because one side ran out of soldiers or swords. It ended because generations of diplomats, kings, and even queens learned to wield something far more enduring: the art of the possible. Each parchment, from the grandiose ambitions of Troyes to the quiet pragmatism of Louviers, was a laboratory for ideas that would shape the modern world. Sovereignty, national identity, the balance of power, these weren't abstract concepts debated in universities. They were forged in the crucible of broken truces and hard-won compromises, tested against the relentless tide of human ambition. Consider the paradox at the heart of these agreements. The very treaties designed to end conflict often sowed the seeds of future wars, while those meant to be temporary, like the Truce of Bruges, revealed unexpected paths to lasting change. They teach us that diplomacy isn't about perfect solutions, but about managing the imperfect ones. When Edward III traded his claim to the French throne for land at Brétigny, or when Charles VII bought time with the marriage alliance at Tours, they weren't surrendering. They were playing the long game, understanding that sometimes the most powerful move is to step back and let time do the work. The true legacy of these treaties lies in their humanity. Behind every clause about borders or ransoms were real people, queens like Isabeau of Bavaria, navigating impossible choices, mediators like the papal legates stitching frayed alliances, even the hostages like Louis of Anjou, whose broken parole exposed the fragility of honor. Their stories remind us that history isn't shaped by faceless forces, but by the messy, courageous, and often flawed individuals who refuse to let war have the final word. So what's the takeaway for us today? Perhaps it's this: conflict may be inevitable, but so is the human instinct to reach across the table. Whether it's a medieval king sealing a truce or modern nations negotiating climate accords, the principles remain the same. Success hinges on understanding your adversary's fears as well as your own, on crafting terms that let both sides save face, and above all, on recognizing that no treaty is an endpoint. It's merely a snapshot in an endless dance of rivalry and reconciliation. As the echoes of these centuries-old agreements linger, they invite us to reflect on our own era's challenges. How do we negotiate when trust is scarce? How do we build peace when the wounds run deep? The answers won't be found in any single document, but in the collective wisdom of those who have sat at the table before us, their triumphs, their miscalculations, and their unshakable belief that even in the darkest times, the pen can be mightier than the sword. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Which of these treaties surprised you the most? Could modern diplomats learn from the compromises of the past? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this conversation alive. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the diplomacy that shaped a continent, don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys through history's untold stories. The past is never really past. It's just waiting for us.